Chapter 1. Introduction, Geography, Early History, and First Settlements. Austria, located in the heart of Europe, has always been an intersection between north, south, east, and west. The geographical position, shaped by the Alps, the Danube, wetlands, and fertile valleys, decisively influenced the historical development of the country. The topography offered both protection and challenge. The Alps protected against outside invasions, but they also made trade and communication more difficult, while the Danube as a transport route made early settlement and the exchange of goods and culture easier. The early history of Austria reaches back to the Paleolithic period. Archaeological finds such as flint tools, bones, and cave paintings show that people had already settled the region more than 30,000 years ago. In areas such as the Danube Valley or the foothills of the Alps, traces of hunter-gatherer societies were found. They lived from hunting wild animals, fishing, and the first beginnings of agriculture and animal husbandry. These early forms of human organization already showed the first social structures and an adaptation to the different climatic and geographical conditions of Austria. With the transition to the Neolithic period, around 5500 BC, settled agriculture began. The first villages appeared in fertile areas such as the Vienna Basin and the Upper Danube region. Farmers cultivated grain, kept livestock, and produced pottery, as well as tools made of stone and wood. The spread of agricultural techniques, such as the plow and irrigation, made stable settlements and a growing population possible. These early communities formed the basis for more complex social structures and for the exchange of ideas, crafts, and trade goods. In the Bronze Age and Iron Age, the region continued to develop into an important junction between the cultures of Central Europe. Trade and contacts with neighboring regions led to the spread of new technologies, such as metalworking, wagon building, and weapon production. The population became increasingly organized in a hierarchical way. Local leaders and tribal chiefs established themselves, and religious practices gained importance. Burial mounds, cult sites, and settlement traces from this period testify to growing wealth and social differentiation. Austria's geographical position made it a transit area from an early period. The Danube, as a highway-like river of antiquity, connected the region with the Roman Empire, the Celtic tribal areas north of the Alps, and the Balkans. These transport routes made trade, migration, and processes of cultural exchange easier. At the same time, the location between the Alps and the Pannonian Basin led to regional differences. While the Alps made transport more difficult, the valleys and basins offered fertile agriculture and settlement areas. In summary, it can be said that the early history of Austria was shaped by adaptation to geographical conditions, the development of agriculture and settled life, and the gradual formation of social structures. From the first hunter-gatherer societies through the Neolithic period to Bronze Age and Iron Age societies, the early settlements laid the foundation for the later political, economic, and cultural development of Austria. Its position in the heart of Europe, the diversity of its landscapes, and the early trade routes formed the basis for the area, later becoming an important center of Europe. In the next chapter, we will look at the Roman period and the province of Noricum, how the region was integrated into the Roman Empire, what economic, military, and cultural developments took place, and how the foundations for urban structures were laid. Chapter 2. The Roman period and the province of Noricum. With the beginning of Roman expansion in Central Europe, the territory of present-day Austria became an important part of the empire. The province of Noricum, which extended across present-day Carinthia, Styria and parts of Upper Austria, was integrated into the Roman sphere around the end of the 1st century BC and became a Roman province in the 1st century AD. It developed into an economically, militarily, and culturally important territory. The Romans brought not only administration and military security, but also infrastructure, urban planning, trade, and new technologies. The economic importance of Noricum lay first in its raw materials. The land was especially known for its deposits of ore, iron, copper, and gold, which were systematically exploited by Roman mines. These raw materials were not only used locally, but also exported throughout the empire, making Noricum an important economic link in the Roman system. In addition, agriculture was promoted. Grain, wine, and olive products, the latter imported or produced locally in small amounts, supplied the population and the Roman legions. Militarily, Noricum was strategically significant. Alpine passes, such as the Reschen Pass, the Brenner Pass, and the Radstetter Tauern Pass, were important transit routes for Roman troops and trade caravans. Legions is stationed in fortified forts such as Verunum in present-day Carinthia or Carnuntum in Lower Austria served both as protection against invading Germanic tribes and as a way to control the local population. The military presence also promoted urbanization. Forts became settlement centers, roads and trade routes were expanded, and the Roman way of life spread increasingly. Culturally and socially, the Romans brought their lifestyle, administration, and religion with them. Cities such as Vindobona, present-day Vienna, became centers of trade, jurisdiction, and culture. Roman temples, theaters, baths, and administrative buildings shaped the urban landscape. The population adapted to Roman customs and adopted language, writing, the legal system, and forms of urban organization. At the same time, the native Celtic culture remained present, merged with Roman traditions, and formed a hybrid cultural identity that had a lasting influence on the area. Infrastructure played a central role. Roads, such as the Via Claudia Augusta, allowed rapid troop movements, trade, and communication between the Roman provinces. Bridges, aqueducts, and fortified road systems created the basis for economic expansion and laid the foundation for later transport routes that still exist today. Integration into the Roman road network changed the area permanently and connected local communities with the entire empire. Religion and society were also transformed. Roman gods and cults were introduced, often merging with local traditions. Temple complexes and cult centers served both worship and political control. The population benefited from Roman jurisdiction, administrative structures, and protection, but had to pay taxes, levies, and perform military service. In summary, it can be said that the Roman period in Noricum was a phase of profound transformation. Economy, military infrastructure, urban planning, and culture were integrated and modernized, while local traditions and Celtic structures remained preserved at the same time. The area became an important part of the Roman Empire, both economically and strategically. The roads, cities, and administrative institutions created during this period formed the key basis for Austria's further development in the early Middle Ages. In the next chapter, we will examine the migration period and the early Middle Ages, the effects of the Germanic peoples, Slavs, and Avars, the emergence of the first structures of rule and the Christianization of the region. Chapter 3. The Migration Period and the Early Middle Ages. After the collapse of Roman rule in the 5th century, the territory of present-day Austria entered the turbulence of the migration period. Germanic tribes, Slavs and Avars used the geopolitical gap created by the withdrawal of the Romans to establish new areas of rule. This era was characterized by insecurity, migration, cultural change, and the emergence of the first local power centers, which laid the foundation for the early Middle Ages. The Germanic peoples, including the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Lombards, used the fertile Danube plain and the foothills of the Alps for their settlements. They left traces in place names, local legal customs, and early agricultural structures. At the same time, conflicts and alliances emerged between the incoming tribes and the remaining Romanized populations groups, some of whom stayed in the cities or withdrew to the slopes of the Alps. Another central actor was the Slavs, who settled from the 6th century onward in the eastern Alpine foothills and in today's southern areas. They brought new settlement forms, agricultural techniques, and craft traditions, which enriched the regional economy. Slavic settlements were often established on hills or near rivers in order to provide protection against attacks, and they developed into the first local centers of power. The merging of Slavic and Germanic elements permanently shaped the ethnic and cultural map of the region. At the same time, the Avars, a nomadic horse people from the steppes of Central Asia, established themselves. They created an area of rule that extended over parts of today's Styria, Lower Austria, and Burgenland. Their control was military in character. The population was partly subjugated, and tribute was collected. The Avars left behind fortifications, graves, and archaeological traces that give an image of social hierarchy, warfare, and trade contacts between East and West. During this period, the Christianization of the region also began. Missionaries from the Frankish Empire and from the late antique church worked to convert the local tribes to Christianity. Monasteries and churches often arose on Celtic or Roman cult sites and served religious, cultural, and administrative purposes. Christianity increasingly became a connecting element between the different ethnic groups and settlement communities. Politically, this phase was marked by local centers of rule. Tribal princes and military leaders consolidated power in fortified settlements, often located on hills or at strategic river crossings. These early territories of rule formed the basis for later dynasties, including the Babenbergs, who from the 10th century onward consolidated central power in the territory of present-day Austria. Economic development was strongly regional. Agriculture, animal husbandry, and crafts dominated, while trade and markets still existed in rudimentary form. Rivers such as the Danube continued to serve as transport routes, and settlements along these routes became centers of exchange between Germanic, Slavic, and later Frankish population groups. In summary, it can be said that the period of migration and the early Middle Ages was shaped by migration, cultural mixing, political fragmentation, and gradual Christianization. Germanic peoples, Slavs and Avars shaped the landscape, settlement structures, and social organization, while the foundations for later consolidation under the Babenbergs were created. This era laid the foundation for Austria's medieval development, both politically and culturally. In the next chapter, we will turn to the Carolingians and the Babenbergs, the integration into the Frankish Empire, early statehood, and the consolidation of political power in the Austrian territories. Chapter 4. The Carolingians and Babenbergs. After the end of the migration period and the consolidation of the different ethnic groups in present-day Austria, the region was increasingly integrated into the political system of the Frankish Empire. Under the Carolingians, who from the 8th century onward succeeded the Merovingians, administration, church, and military structures were reorganized. At the same time, the Babenbergs established themselves as a local dynasty. In the 10th century, they began to strengthen their rule over the territory of the later Eastern March, the core of present-day Austria. This period was decisive for the formation of political structures that would shape medieval Austria for centuries. The Carolingians introduced strict administration with the aim of securing control over widely scattered territories. Territorial rulers and counts were appointed to organize tax collection, jurisdiction, and defense. The territory of present-day Austria was divided into so-called marches, border regions that were militarily secured and administered. The Eastern March, later known as the Austrian Core Land, served as a defense against Hungarians and Slavic tribes, and was at the same time a link between the Frankish Empire and the eastern territories of Central Europe. Parallel to this, the Babenbergs established themselves as local holders of power. Originally appointed as counts, they used phases of weakness in the central authority to strengthen their independence. They built castles, organized local administration, and secured their power through marriage alliances with neighboring noble families. Under the Babenbergs, the region around Vienna, Lower Austria, and parts of Styria became a stable center of power that became increasingly important both economically and militarily. Economically, the region benefited from integration into the Frankish Empire. New trade routes were opened, markets emerged, and agriculture became more efficient through Frankish techniques and organization. River systems, such as the Danube, made the transport of goods possible and helped connect the Babenberg lands with the rest of the empire. The population benefited from relative stability, but could also be heavily burdened by taxes and services. Christianization was another central aspect of this period. Carolingian missionaries and monasteries spread the Christian faith, built churches and schools, and established church hierarchies. These institutions served not only religious control, but also administration, the enforcement of law and education. The church was therefore a central stabilizing factor that supported Babenberg rule and at the same time promoted cultural development. The Eastern March was a strategic bulwark. The Babenbergs organized troops, built fortifications, and secured important passes in the Alps. Control over the Danube and neighboring areas was crucial in order to defend the region against Hungarian raids, Slavic attacks, and internal uprisings. This defensive orientation shaped the military culture and the organization of Babenberg rule for centuries. In summary, it can be said that the Carolingians and Babenbergs laid the foundations for Austria's political, economic, and cultural development. Through integration into the Frankish Empire, the establishment of administrative structures, the consolidation of Babenberg rule, and Christianization, stable power structures emerged that allowed the region to play a central role in Central Europe during the Middle Ages. The combination of military security, economic development, and cultural integration formed the basis for the later flourishing of Vienna and the Austrian territory. In the next chapter, we will turn to the Middle Ages, the Babenbergs of Flusts, and the rise of Vienna, how Vienna and Lower Austria grew economically, culturally, and politically into a center, and how the region gained increasing importance in Central Europe. Chapter 5. The Middle Ages, the Babenbergs, and the rise of Vienna. In the High Middle Ages, between the 12th and 13th centuries, the territory of today's Austrian federal states developed under Babenberg rule into a regional center of power. Vienna, in particular, emerged during this period as an economic, political, and cultural center. The combination of geographical location, strategic politics, and economic dynamism made the region a junction for trade, administration, and culture in the heart of Europe. The Babenbergs strengthened their power through targeted territorial policy. They consolidated their rule over Lower Austria, Styria, and the Vienna Basin, expanded castles and fortified towns, and secured their borders against Hungarian raids and Slavic attacks. The Eastern March was now not only militarily, but also administratively stable, which formed the basis for economic development and urban growth. Vienna gained importance in this phase. The city benefited from its location on the Danube, which made the transport of goods from southern and central Europe easier. Markets and trading places emerged in which grain, wine, cloth goods, and metal products were traded. The city developed into a center of crafts, trade, and administration that increasingly influenced the cultural development of the region as well. Through privileges granted to the city by the Babenbergs, importance as an urban center grew, both for local nobles and for merchants from all over Europe. Culture and education were also promoted. Monasteries, churches, and abbeys such as Melk Abbey served not only religious purposes, but also education, manuscript culture, and administration. Monks and clerics formed an educated elite that shaped economic, cultural, and political life. At the same time, the first beginnings of urban self-government were established, granting citizens certain rights and contributing to stability. Militarily, the Babenbergs remained present. Control over Alpine passes, Danube crossings, and strategic castles ensured not only the security of the territory, but also the protection and control of trade routes. The military strength of the Babenbergs was also a symbol of their legitimacy and made them an important actor in the political conflicts of Central Europe. Economically, the region benefited from a combination of agricultural production, crafts, and trade. Fertile soils in the Vienna Basin allowed grain cultivation and viticulture, while crafts and manufacturing grew in the cities. The Danube was central as a transport route, and proximity to other trading centers, such as Prague or Regensburg, made the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies possible. This contributed decisively to economic consolidation and to the prosperity of the population. Politically and socially, this development led to stronger differentiation. Nobles, urban citizens, and clerics increasingly developed different roles and spheres of influence. The Babenbergs retained supreme authority, while cities such as Vienna received a growing degree of autonomy. This dynamic formed the basis for later conflicts and the increasing importance of urban self-government in the late Middle Ages. In summary, it can be said that under the Babenbergs, and through the rise of Vienna, the territory of present-day Austria developed into a central power and economic center of Central Europe. Military strength, economic growth, cultural promotion, and administrative consolidation laid the foundation for the later flourishing of the region under the Habsburgs. Vienna established itself as the urban and political core, while Lower Austria and Styria served as a stable base for trade, agriculture, and rule. In the next chapter, we will look at the Habsburg dynasty and the consolidation of power in the late Middle Ages, how the Habsburgs laid the foundation for a major European realm in Austria. Chapter 6. The Habsburg dynasty and the consolidation of power. In the late Middle Ages, from the 15th century onward, the Habsburgs took over rule in Austria, and thereby laid the foundation for a centuries-long dynasty that decisively shaped the political, economic, and cultural life of Central Europe. While the Babenbergs had established early statehood and urbanization, the Habsburgs strengthened territorial control, developed a centralized administration, and used marriage alliances to extend their power across the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs initially focused on territorial consolidation. Under Archduke Rudolf IV, also called the Founder, administration, legal systems, and urban organization were modernized. Cities such as Vienna, Graz, and Linz received urban privileges, while castles and fortresses guaranteed the security of rule. The Habsburgs recognized early that control had to be secured not only militarily but also administratively in order to ward off uprisings, feudal political conflicts, or external threats. A central mechanism of Habsburg rule was marriage policy. Strategically arranged marriages, for example with Spanish, Burgundian, or Bohemian dynasties, expanded the Habsburg power base beyond Austria. The famous saying, "Bella gerent ali, tu felix Austria nube," meaning "let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry," aptly describes this strategy. Through dynastic licenses, the Habsburgs secured influence, territories, and political networks without immediately having to rely on military force. Economic development was closely linked to Habsburg stability. Agriculture and trade were promoted, markets expanded, and customs systems introduced. The Danube remained a central transport and trade route, connecting Austria's cities and making exchange with Bohemia, Hungary, and southern Germany possible. Craft and urban production flourished, while monasteries and abbeys formed economic and cultural centers that promoted education, art, and science. Culturally, the Habsburgs strengthened their power by promoting religion, art, and architecture. Vienna and other cities received magnificent churches, administrative buildings, and residences. The rulers understood that representative architecture and religious institutions legitimized the dynasty and encouraged loyalty. At the same time, the foundations for the later artistic flowerings under the Habsburgs in the Baroque period, which would make Vienna one of the most important cultural centers of Europe. Militarily, Habsburg rule was shaped by border security and defensive policy. The Duchy of Austria was exposed to Hungarian, Bohemian, and Ottoman threats. Castles, fortresses, and standing troops secured the dynasty's power, and at the same time made it possible to control the population. This defensive orientation was often decisive in preserving political stability and protecting the dynasty against internal rivals or external powers. The integration of administration and law was another element of consolidation. The Habsburgs established a system of estates, jurisdictions, and centralized administrations that made the exercise of power easier while also respecting local traditions. This system made control over taxes, levies, and military obligations possible without permanently endangering the loyalty of the population. In summary, can be said that the Habsburgs laid the foundation for Austrian state formation as it would be known in the following centuries. Through territorial cohesion, marriage policy, economic promotion, cultural representation, and military security, they consolidated their power and established Austria as a central ruling center in the Holy Roman Empire. In the next chapter, we will look at Austria in the age of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. How religious conflicts shook the country, how the Habsburgs asserted their power, and how church, state, and population collided. Chapter 7. Austria in the Age of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. In the 16th century, Austria, like many parts of Central Europe, was drawn into the turbulence of the Reformation. Martin Luther's theses of 1517 and the spread of Reformation ideas led to profound religious, social, and political changes. The Reformation threatened the authority of the Habsburgs, who, as a Catholic dynasty, legitimized their power not only politically but also religiously. The following Counter-Reformation shaped the country for decades and left traces in society, culture, and politics. In Austria, the Reformation initially found support mainly among urban population groups and the nobility. Cities such as Vienna, Graz, and Linz became centers of the Reformation movement, where trade, crafts, and the urban elite were receptive to the teachings of Luther and later Zwingli. The urban nobility also used the new ideas politically in order to extend control over monasteries and church property. The Reformation offered opportunities for economic independence, social mobility, and ideological influence. The Habsburg reacted hesitantly at first, but the threat to their political and religious authority grew quickly. Emperor Ferdinand I and his successors began to suppress Reformation movements and strengthen the Catholic Church. The Counter-Reformation became a strategic policy. The Jesuit order and Catholic clergy were brought into the country, monasteries were reformed, schools were founded, and the population was deliberately tied again to the Catholic faith. This happened not only religiously, but also politically, because in this way the Habsburgs contained resistance against their rule. Culturally, the Counter-Reformation brought a flourishing period. Churches, monasteries, and residences were magnificently expanded. Art and music served to demonstrate Catholic power. Architecture, painting, and liturgical practice became instruments of re-Catholicization. The Jesuits played a central role in this process, not only in education and religion, but also in the social organization and cultural shaping of the population. Militarily, the Reformation was closely connected with conflicts. Uprisings by Protestant communities were sometimes suppressed. Militarily, castles and cities were secured, and regional rulers were forced to show loyalty. The conflicts between Protestantism and Catholicism intensified already existing tensions between different noble families, cities, and the central power of the Habsburgs. Economically, the Reformation had both short-term and long-term consequences. Many monasteries, which had previously been economic centers, were reformed or dissolved. Their lands fell to secular rulers. This led to a redistribution of property and power, promoted urban growth, and changed the structure of agriculture, trade, and the money economy. At the same time, education and economic efficiency were promoted through Jesuits and other Catholic institutions. which in the long term secured the stability of Habsburg rule. Socially, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation were reflected in divisive conflicts. Protestant communities sometimes existed secretly, while public institutions and schools were dominated by Catholicism. The population was forced to weigh loyalty to the dynasty against religious convictions. These tensions shaped social life, jurisdiction, and everyday coexistence for generations. In sum, it can be said that the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in Austria were not only religious movements, but also political, social, and cultural processes. The Habsburgs used the Catholic Church to strengthen their power. Cities and nobility were integrated into loyalty and religious practice, and art, education, and architecture served re-Catholicization. The Jesuits played a central role in this process, not only in education and religion, but also in the social organization and cultural shaping of the population. Militarily, the Reformation was closely connected with conflicts. Uprisings by Protestant communities were sometimes suppressed militarily. Castles and cities were secured, and regional rulers were forced to show loyalty. The conflicts between Protestantism and Catholicism intensified the already existing tensions between different noble families, cities, and the central power of the Habsburgs. Economically, the Reformation had both short-term and long-term consequences. Many monasteries, which had previously been economic centers, were reformed or dissolved. Their lands fell to secular rulers. This led to a redistribution of property and power, promoted urban growth, and changed the structure of agriculture, trade, and the money economy. At the same time, education and economic efficiency were promoted through the Jesuits and other Catholic institutions, which, in the long term, secured the stability of Habsburg rule. Socially, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation were reflected in divisive conflicts. Protestant communities sometimes existed secretly, while public institutions and schools were dominated by Catholicism. The population was forced to weigh loyalty to the dynasty against religious convictions. These tensions shaped social life, jurisdiction, and everyday coexistence for generations. In summary, it can be said that the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in Austria were not only religious movements, but also political, social, and cultural processes. The Habsburgs used the Catholic Church to strengthen their power. Cities and nobility were integrated into loyalty and religious practice, and art, education, and architecture served re-Catholicization. This phase had a lasting impact on Austria and laid the foundations for later political and cultural consolidation under the Habsburgs in the Baroque period. In the next chapter, we will look at the 30 Years' War, the effects of the Great Wars, the destruction, the population crisis, and, at the same time, the cultural and architectural flowering of the Baroque in Austria. Chapter 8. The 30 Years' War and the Baroque period. The 17th century represented for Austria a time of dramatic challenges, but also of cultural flourishing. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, which entered history as one of the most devastating conflicts in Europe, left deep traces in the population, the economy, and the political order. At the same time, this war indirectly initiated a flourishing of culture, architecture, and art known as the Baroque period, which permanently shaped Austrian identity. The 30 Years' War began as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers in the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly developed into a European power struggle with political, dynastic, and territorial motives. Austria, as the core land of the Habsburgs, was drawn directly into the war. Imperial troops fought against Protestant princes, Sweden, France, and other powers, while the population suffered under quartering, looting, hunger, and disease. Entire regions were depopulated, villages destroyed, and economic structures paralyzed for years. The social consequences were devastating. Population decline, crop failures, and the destruction of trade and crafts led to a severe crisis. Many peasants and craftsmen became impoverished, while cities were burdened by refugee flows and rising levies. Fear of violence and insecurity shaped everyday life and led to a mixture of resignation, religious withdrawal, and loyalty toward the emperor as a protective power. Politically, the Habsburgs strengthened their power after the war through stronger centralization and re-Catholicization. The military crisis had shown that loose federal structures and religious divisions were dangerous. Through the restoration of imperial authority, control over the estates, and the support of the Catholic Church, the Habsburgs were able to secure political stability. The Counter-Reformation now reached its final completion. Protestant communities were restricted, monasteries and the Jesuit order were strengthened, and Catholic values dominated public life. Despite, or precisely because of, this difficult political and economic situation, a cultural flowering of the Baroque began in Austria. Magnificent churches, monasteries, and palaces were built to represent the power, faith, and triumph of the Habsburgs. Vienna became a center of Baroque architecture, painting, and music. Artists such as Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach and composers such as Heinrich Ignaz, Franz Bieber shaped the artistic scene. The buildings were meant to demonstrate not only beauty, but also rule and order. This was a connection of religion, politics, and art that was characteristic of the Baroque period. Economically, a slow recovery began after the war. Agricultural production, trade, and crafts were rebuilt, supported by reforms, infrastructure measures, and the stabilization of administration. Monasteries and church institutions played an important role in this. They were not only religious centers, but also economic and cultural engines in the regions. The Baroque period also had social consequences. Nobles, citizens, and clergy were more strongly integrated into a hierarchical system that promoted both social order and loyalty to the Habsburgs. Religious festivals, ceremonies, and art served to integrate the population into this order and strengthened the sense of community in a time that had previously been shaped by destruction and insecurity. In summary, it can be said that the 30 Years' War brought destruction, suffering, and economic crisis to Austria. At the same time, however, it created the conditions for stable, centralized Habsburg rule and a cultural flowering that culminated in the Baroque. Military strength, political centrage, religious control, and artistic representation combined into a system that shaped Austria for centuries and established Vienna as a cultural and political center of Europe. In the next chapter, we will turn to Austria in the age of Habsburg great power status, political expansion, administration, foreign policy, and Austria's role as a Central European great power in the centuries after the 30 Years' War. Chapter 9. Austria in the Age of Habsburg Great Power Status. After the 30 Years' War, the Habsburgs strengthened their position as one of the leading powers of Central Europe. The 17th and 18th centuries were for Austria a phase of territorial expansion, administrative centralization, and cultural flourishing. At the same time, the dynasty faced challenges from external opponents, internal tensions, and the need to integrate the different peoples and regions of its growing realm. Politically, the Habsburgs consolidated their power through centralization and bureaucratization. The emperor, supported by a growing body of officials, created institutions that collected taxes, administered justice, and unified administration. Estates and local nobles retained certain rights, but had to recognize imperial authority. This mixture of central control and regional participation made the stabilization of the multi-ethnic state possible and reduced the danger of local uprisings. Territorially, Austria expanded systematically in the centuries after the war. Through marriage policy, wars, and diplomatic treaties, the Habsburg realm grew toward Bohemia, Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of Italy. The dynasty secured strategic territories that were economically valuable and controlled important trade routes. At the same time, it forced the loyalty of regional elites through political offices, marriage connections, and military presence. Militarily, Austria remained heavily challenged. The borders with France, the Ottoman Empire, and smaller German principalities were contested. The Habsburgs built standing armies, modernized fortresses, and used military innovations to secure their power. Vienna became the central command center and the base for political and military decisions, while other cities such as Linz, Graz, and Prague represented strategic outposts. Economically, Austria benefited from a revival after the years of war. Agriculture, mining, and trade were promoted, and the integration of new territories brought additional resources such as ore, wood, grain, and livestock. Cities and markets grew, while infrastructure projects, including roads, bridges, and canals, made trade easier and enabled economic networking. Monasteries and church institutions continued to play a central role as cultural and economic centers. Culturally, the Habsburg period was a flourishing phase of the Baroque. Magnificent palaces, churches, monasteries, and public buildings arose in Vienna, Linz, Salzburg, and other cities. Architecture, painting, music, and literature served not only aesthetic purposes, but also the representation of power, religious authority, and social order. Artists such as Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, Johann Michael Rothmeier, and musicians of the Vienna Court Chapel shaped the era and made Vienna a center of European culture. Religiously, the dynasty continued to rely on Catholicism and the Counter-Reformation. The Church was closely connected with rule. The Jesuit order, monasteries, and church schools spread Catholic values, promoted education, and secured loyalty. At the same time, Protestant currents were monitored or suppressed in order to preserve the unity of the realm and strengthen central power. Socially, Habsburg policy led to clear hierarchy. Nobility, clergy, and urban elites formed the supporting class, while peasants and craftsmen were bound to levies and services. At the same time, economic and cultural development opened opportunities for advancement for citizens, craftsmen, and scholars who could distinguish themselves in administration, trade, or art. In summary, it can be said that the age of Habsburg great power status was shaped by territorial expansion, centralized administration, military security, and cultural flourishing. Austria developed into a stable and influential multi-ethnic state that played a central role in Central Europe politically, economically, and culturally. The dynasty created structures that formed the basis for Austria's power and prestige in the coming centuries and established Vienna as a political and cultural center. In the next chapter, we will look at Maria Theresa and Joseph II, reforms and centralization, Enlightenment, administrative reforms, educational measures, and social changes that shaped Austria in the middle of the 18th century. Chapter 10. Maria Theresa and Joseph II, reforms and centralization. The middle of the 18th century marked a decisive phase in Austrian history. Under the rule of Maria Theresa, from 740 to 1780, and her son Joseph II, from 1780 to 1790, the country experienced profound political, administrative, and social reforms. This period was shaped by the attempt to centralize Habsburg power, make administration more efficient, and modernize society in the spirit of the Enlightenment, while the balance between tradition, religion, and reform always remained a challenge. Maria Theresa took power in a difficult situation. The problem of the pragmatic sanction had secured dynastic succession, but the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748 called the stability of her realm into question. The young empress showed political pragmatism and strategic foresight early on. She reorganized administration, introduced strict control over state officials, and promoted uniform laws in Austria's core lands. In doing so, she laid the foundation for a modern bureaucratic apparatus that could efficiently administer the multi-ethnic state. Under Maria Theresa, educational policy was reformed. She recognized that an educated citizenry and an efficient administration were closely connected. Schools were standardized, curricula reformed, and compulsory education introduced. Monasteries and church institutions continued to play a central role in education, but state control grew. These reforms promoted not only literacy, but also the political and economic stability of the realm. Tax and economic reforms were also central. Maria Theresa tried to make the tax system fairer, distribute burdens across broader sections of the populations, and secure the revenues of the state. Agricultural production was promoted, trade routes improved, and control over important raw materials and customs centralized. These measures strengthened the economic foundation of the Habsburg realm and prepared the country for the challenges of industrial change. Her son Joseph II continued the reforms and went much further. Joseph was a representative of the enlightened absolutist state. He tried to organize the realm according to rational principles. Administration, jurisdiction, and the church were reformed, religious toleration was introduced, and many medieval privileges were abolished. Under Joseph II, the abolition of monasteries that did not serve charitable or educational purposes was enforced, which led to considerable tensions with the church, but strengthened the resources of the state. Joseph's reforms reached deeply into the structure of society. Serfdom was abolished or strongly restricted in many regions, and peasants received more rights. At the same time, Joseph tried to strengthen urban self-government, promote trade and commerce, and unify the legal system. Many reforms met resistance, especially from the nobility and the church. Nevertheless, they left a legacy of modernization that laid the foundations for the later 19th century. Culturally, both rulers promoted science, art, and architecture. Imperial court culture flourished. Theater, music, and painting were supported, and Vienna continued to develop as a European center of the arts. Maria Theresa and Joseph II also used culture as a means of political legitimation in order to present the dynasty as modern, educated, and powerful. In summary, it can be said that the era of Maria Theresa and Joseph II was an epoch of profound reforms, centralization, and modernization. Administration, education, economy, and the legal system were rationalized. Social structures were partly liberalized, and culture and religion were used as tools of political stability. These reforms laid the foundation for the long-term strengthening of Habsburg rule, strengthened the economic and social basis of the realm, and prepared Austria for the challenges of the late 18th century. In the next chapter, we will look at the Napoleonic Wars and Austria's territorial change, the loss and recovery of territories, the battles against France, and the effects on the population, army, and administration. Chapter 11. The Napoleonic Wars and Territorial Change. The late 18th and early 19th centuries placed Austria before one of the greatest challenges in its history: the Napoleonic Wars. From 1792 to 1815, radically changed the political landscape of Europe and forced the Habsburgs to repeatedly adapt their strategy, military organization, and territorial control. Austria was challenged both militarily and diplomatically. It had to defend territories, recover lost lands, and secure the stability of the empire under difficult conditions. The conflicts began with the revolutionary upheavals in France. The new French ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity called the absolutist order of the Habsburgs into question. Already in the First Coalition Wars against revolutionary France, military conflicts took place in the Netherlands, Italy, and along the Danube. Austria lost battles several times, had to cede territories, and recognized the need for military reforms in order to face the new opponent. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 marked an especially severe setback. Napoleon decisively defeated the Austrian-Russian troops, which led to massive territorial losses, political humiliation, and strategic reorganization. Austria had to accept territorial losses in Italy and southern Germany, and recognized that military modernization and strategic adaptation were urgently necessary. Despite these setbacks, Habsburg rule showed flexibility. Through diplomatic alliances, marriage alliances, and renewed military reforms, Austria did not succeed in finally defeating the French at the Battle of Wagram in 1809, but it did at least stabilize its strategic position. This phase made clear the importance of a professional army, logistical supply, and central planning, elements that were later adopted throughout the European system of warfare. The Napoleonic Wars also led to territorial changes. After Napoleon's victory in Central Europe, Austrian possessions in Italy, southern Germany, and the Netherlands were reorganized or lost, while Austria was later able to recover territories in southern Germany and Italy. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 marked the final reorganization. Austria received important territories such as Tyrol, Galicia, and the Lombard-Venetian Kingdom, and strengthened its role as a Central European great power. Economically, the wars were an enormous burden. The mobilization of soldiers, the supply of armies, and the destruction of trade routes led to an economic crisis. Agricultural production fell, trade and commerce were interrupted, and taxes had to be drastically increased. At the same time, however, the war also promoted the modernization of the army, administration, and, in part, industry, because new production methods and organizational capabilities became necessary. Socially, the wars had far-reaching consequences. The population, cities and villages suffered under quartering, looting, and mobilization. At the same time, awareness of national identity, loyalty to the emperor, and the need to preserve social stability despite external threat grew. The, the experiences of this wartime shaped generations of soldiers, officials, and citizens, and influenced Austria's political thinking in the 19th century. Culturally, artists and intellectuals reacted to the wartime through patriotism, historical reflection, and literary treatment. Plays, paintings, and musical works addressed courage, willingness to sacrifice, and destruction caused by Napoleon, which strengthened national identity and the Habsburg dynasty. In summary, it can be said that the Napoleonic Wars led to severe military setbacks, territorial changes, and economic burdens, but at the same time forced Austria into strategic adaptation, administrative reform, and military modernization. The reorganization of Europe through the Congress of Vienna strengthened Austria's position as a central great power and prepared the way for political stability, economic recovery, and cultural development in the 19th century. In the next chapter, we will look at the Biedermeier period and the Vormärz, an epoch shaped by political restoration, social order, emerging industrialization, and growing liberal thought. Chapter 12. Biedermeier and Vormärz. The Biedermeier period, after 1815, and the Vormärz's period up to 1848 mark in Austrian history, a time between political restoration, social stability, and the quiet but steadily growing preparation for social upheavals. After the Napoleonic Wars, Austria was territorially secured, militarily stabilized, and economically on the path to recovery. Politically, the Habsburgs relied on control, bureaucracy, and censorship, while the population lived in a state of relative internal security. Under Emperor Francis I and later Ferdinand I, the principles of restoration dominated. After the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Habsburgs and other European powers wanted to restore the old order that seemed to have been threatened by the revolutions and the Napoleonic Wars. Press, censorship, police state methods, and strict control of universities and political associations were means of containing liberal and revolutionary ideas. The population therefore experienced a phase of stability, but also political repression. Socially, the Biedermeier period was marked by withdrawal into private life, family, and the local bourgeois world. Political participation was strongly restricted, and people concentrated on their immediate surroundings, social networks, home and family. At the same time, culture, art, and literature flourished in private and urban spaces. Painting, music, and literature reflected the idyll of everyday life, the longing for harmony, and the subtle tensions between tradition and modernity. The economy was shaped by slow industrialization. Crafts, trade, and early manufactories developed, while infrastructure projects such as road construction, railways, and canals gradually improved connections between the regions. Agriculture remained central for supply, but growing urbanization led to new social classes, especially urban citizens, factory workers, and small entrepreneurs. The Vormärz period, approximately from 1830 to 1848, was by contrast characterized by growing political consciousness and emerging liberalism. Universities, literary salons, and political circles discussed reforms, national unity, and civil rights. Ideas of freedom, equality, and national identity spread, fueled by the liberal movement in Germany, and by social tensions in the Austrian multi-ethnic state. This pressure led to the first uprisings, secret political organizations, and demands for a constitutional order. Despite political repression, the Biedermeier period was culturally flourishing. Viennese music, theater, painting, and architecture continued to develop. The tradition of Viennese classical music remained influential, while literary works reflected everyday culture, social observations, and subtle criticism of the political situation. During this period, many institutions emerged that later shaped Austria's political and cultural landscape. Socially, the combination of stability and repression led to a certain duality. Citizens enjoyed cultural, economic, and social security, but had to hold back politically. This tension between security and oppression formed the breeding ground for the Revolution of 1848, which brought suppressed political desires and social tensions openly to the surface. In summary, it can be said that the Biedermeier and Vormärz period was shaped by political restoration, social order, and cultural flourishing. At the same time, however, dissatisfaction grew, igniting demands for political reform and national identity. This epoch laid the foundation for the revolutionary movements in Central Europe and for Austria's later development as a modern state. In the next chapter, we will look at the Revolution of 1848 and Emperor Franz Joseph I, the political upheaval, liberalization, the emperor's reaction, and the long-term stabilization of Habsburg rule. Chapter 13. The Revolution of 1848 and Emperor Franz Joseph I. The year 1848 was a turning point in the history of Austria and Central Europe. The Revolution of 1848 shook the Habsburg monarchy, brought political demands for liberalization, civil rights, and national self-determination onto the agenda, and eventually led to last consolidation under the young Emperor Franz Joseph I, who prepared the country for the challenges of the late 19th century. The causes of the revolution were complex. Political repression during the Vormärz period, economic crises, hunger, and social inequality had created an explosive mixture. The population demanded liberal constitutions, freedom of the press, participation, and the abolition of feudal privileges. At the same time, the different nationalities within the multi-ethnic monarchy, including Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, and Croats, pressed for greater autonomy and cultural rights. This variety of interests led to complex tensions between liberal citizens, peasants, and national groups. In March 1848, the situation escalated in Vienna. Popular uprisings, student protests, and citizen guards forced Emperor Ferdinand I to make concessions. He promised reforms, a new constitution, and the convening of a Reichstag. These first successes showed the power of the population and the need for the Habsburgs to respond to the demands of their subjects. The revolution quickly spread to other parts of the monarchy. In Hungary, Hungarian nationalists under the leadership of Lajos Kossuth rose up and demanded autonomy and independent administration. In Bohemia, Italy, and Dalmatia, further uprisings occurred, placing the Habsburgs before enormous political and military challenges. The army, which had previously shown military discipline and loyalty, played a decisive role in suppressing many uprisings. On December 2, 1848, Franz Joseph I took power. At only 18 years of age, he had to contain the revolution, stabilize the monarchy, and at the same time implement reforms that would calm the population. He showed political pragmatism. Liberal demands were partly implemented. Administration and law were modernized, while centralized imperial control was strengthened. Military power and diplomatic skill helped suppress the uprisings and secure the monarchy's territorial claims. A central element was the constitutional question. Franz Joseph at first tried to give way to liberal demands, but at the same time introduced measures that strengthened the control of the emperor and the central authorities. The revolution led to a partially constitutional order, but one that remained strongly shaped by monarchical centralism. This balance between reform and authoritarian control shaped Austria's political structure for the coming decades. Economically and socially, the revolution was also formative. Peasant reforms were accelerated, feudal dues were partly abolished, and urban self-government was strengthened. At the same time, economic modernization was advanced through railway construction, industrialization, and the promotion of trade. These measures improved the economic foundation and contributed in the long term to the stabilization of the state. Culturally and ideologically, the revolution had a broad effect. It brought discussions about national identity, civil rights, and social justice into public debate. Artists, writers, and intellectuals used the revolutionary mood to spread ideas about freedom, equality, and national self-determination. At the same time, Franz Joseph's rule relied on symbolism, representation, and imperial splendor in order to secure loyalty and stability. In summary, it can be said that the Revolution of 1848 placed Austria before an existential challenge. It brought liberal, social, and national demands to the table, some of which were implemented and some rejected. Franz Joseph I succeeded in stabilizing the monarchy, introducing reforms and securing political control. These events shaped Austria's further development. A balance of modernization, centralization, and authoritarian control that formed the basis for the Austrian Empire and Austria-Hungary in the later 19th century. In the next chapter, we will look at industrialization and urbanization in Austria, how economy, society, and cities reacted to the transformation of production methods, and how the foundation for modern Austrian society was created. Chapter 14. Industrialization and Urbanization. The second half of the 19th century in Austria was shaped by rapid industrialization and urbanization, which had profound effects on economy, society, and politics. The monarchical structure under Franz Joseph continued to exist, but technical, economic, and social changes began to challenge the foundations of the traditional order, and at the same time created new opportunities for prosperity, mobility, and social dynamism. Industrialization began first in Central European cities and regions that already had infrastructure, trade, and resources. Vienna, Sinz, Graz, and Brno developed into industrial centers. Factories for textiles, machine building, iron and steel production grew, while the railway made the connection between cities, regions, and international trade easier. The railway became a symbol of progress. It made rapid transport of raw materials, finished products, and people possible, and permanently changed the economic and social structure of the empire. The population reacted to this change with massive urbanization. People moved from the countryside to the cities in order to find work in factories. The urban population grew exponentially, which led to new social classes. Factory workers, craftsmen, commercial employees, and entrepreneurs formed the urban proletariat and the urban middle class. These developments changed the social structure. Traditional roles, power relations, and neighborhood structures were challenged by industrial labor, mass housing, and new communication routes. Industrialization also had economic consequences. Austria began to establish itself as an industrial and technical center of Central Europe. Mining, especially coal, iron, and ore, was intensified, while new technologies were used in production, energy generation, and transport. Banks and insurance companies grew as supporting institutions that provided loans and organized investments. At the same time, social differences increased. Wealth was concentrated among entrepreneurs and elites, while workers often suffered under precarious conditions. Politically, industrialization brought new challenges for Habsburg rule. The growing urban working class and emerging bourgeoisie increasingly demanded political participation, workers' rights, and social reforms. At the same time, nationality conflicts within the multi-ethnic state became sharper. Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, Slovenes, and other groups demanded recognition, political participation, and cultural autonomy. The monarchy reacted with a combination of repression, political integration, and economic promotion in order to preserve stability. Culturally, urbanization reflected social change. Theaters, operas, newspapers, schools, and associations developed rapidly in order to entertain, educate, and organize the new urban population. Vienna became a center of European culture, while cities such as Brno, Graz, and Linz formed industrial and cultural centers. Education and enlightenment were increasingly extended to broader sections of the population, which in the long term strengthened social integration and political awareness. Socially, industrialization brought both challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, social mobility grew. Workers could rise through education, unions, and migration. Entrepreneurs benefited from new markets. On the other hand, problems such as overpopulation, poor housing conditions, disease, and social tensions arose, triggering political conflicts and the need for reform. The monarchy had to find ways to combine prosperity, social order, and political stability. In summary, it can be said that industrialization and urbanization transformed Austria profoundly. Economic modernization, technological progress, urban growth, and social change created both opportunities and tensions. The developments prepared the ground for political reforms, the emergence of a modern civil society, and the growing importance of social and national questions in the multi-ethnic state. Austria changed from an agrarian society into a dynamic, industrial, and urbanized country, whose cities and infrastructure formed the basis for the 20th century. In the next chapter, we will turn to Austria-Hungary, dualism, and the multi-ethnic state, the political structure, nationality problems, and foreign policy challenges of the dual monarchy after 1867. Chapter 15. Austria-Hungary, Dualism, and the Multi-Ethnic State. The creation of Austria-Hungary in 1867 marked a turning point in the history of the Habsburg monarchy. After the lost war against Prussia in 1866 and the growing pressure of Hungarian nationalists, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 was agreed. The dual monarchy emerged, consisting of Cisleithania, Austria, and Transleithania, Hungary, connected by the common emperor, foreign policy, military, and finances, but administratively largely independent. This political construction was a solution intended to stabilize the multi-ethnic state, but in the long term, it brought new challenges. The political structure was characterized by dualism. Austria and Hungary had their own parliaments, administrations, tax systems, and legal systems. The emperor remained the head of both parts and determined foreign policy, the army, and common financial matters, while administration remained largely independent. This political construction was a solution intended to stabilize the multi-ethnic state, but in the long term, it brought new challenges. The political structure was characterized by dualism. Austria and Hungary had their own parliaments, administrations, tax systems, and legal systems. The emperor remained the head of both parts. He determined foreign policy, the army, and common financial matters, but administration remained largely independent. This structure was a compromise that, on the one hand, accommodated Hungarian nationalists, and on the other hand, preserved Austrian central power. For the other nationalities, including Czechs, Slovenes, Croats, Romanians, Slovaks, and others, however, this often meant underrepresentation and growing political tensions. Nationality conflicts shaped the multi-ethnic state permanently. Czechs demanded autonomy within Bohemia, Croats greater self-government, Italians in South Tyrol cultural rights, while German Austrians and Hungarian Magyars wanted to secure their political dominance. These tensions made legislation more difficult, led to political blockades, and forced the Habsburgs to find a balance between centralism and local participation. The multi-ethnic state was therefore a permanent challenge to political stability. Economically, Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic state with a mixture of industry and agriculture. Bohemia and Moravia became industrial centers for machine building, textile production, and mining, while Hungary remained strongly agricultural. The railway played a central role. It connected the regions, made trade easier, and strengthened economic integration. Vienna and Budapest developed into urban and cultural centers, while smaller cities and rural areas remained marked by regional disparities. Socially, dualism led to differentiation among the population. Urban citizens and workers in industrial regions became increasingly politically and socially organized, while the rural population often remained in traditional structures. Trade unions, political parties, and national organizations grew during this period, increasing social mobilization and political participation. At the same time, conservative forces remained strong, especially in administration, the military, and the church, which promoted social control and loyalty to the emperor. Culturally, the dual monarchy was a flourishing region of diversity. In Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and Brno, theaters, opera houses, universities, and literary salons emerged. Music, architecture, and science benefited from the integration of different cultures and from support by state institutions. At the same time, art and literature reflected the tensions and conflicts of the nationalities, processing themes of identity, loyalty, and modernity. In foreign policy, Austria-Hungary faced challenges mainly from Prussia, Germany, Italy, and the Russian Empire. The policy of the dual monarchy was defensive and oriented toward alliances. Imperial diplomacy sought to preserve the balance of power, secure territorial interests, and connect national tensions at home with foreign policy pragmatism. Foreign policy was therefore closely connected with internal stability. In summary, it can be said that Austria-Hungary was a complex, multi-ethnic state that was characterized by dualism, but also challenged politically, socially, and nationally. The Compromise of 1867 created administrative structures, economic integration, and cultural diversity, but at the same time brought tensions that burdened the political system in the long term. The dual monarchy was therefore a unique but difficult model of European multi-ethnic statehood, which led Austria into the second half of the 19th century and set the stage for the First World War. In the next chapter, we will deal with the First World War and the collapse of the monarchy. The causes, the course of the war, the social burdens, and the end of Habsburg rule in 1918. Chapter 16. The First World War and the collapse of the monarchy. The beginning of the First World War in 1914 marked a dramatic turning point for Austria-Hungary. The assassination in Sarajevo, in which Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne, was murdered, triggered a chain of events that plunged the already fragile, multi-ethnic empire into total war. The monarchy, already burdened by national tensions and economic inequalities, found itself confronted with military, political, and social challenges that tested its stability and ultimately led to its collapse. Austria-Hungary entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, together with Germany and later the Ottoman Empire. The military strategy of the empire was aimed at defense